So perhaps you're a little bit early in your performing careers to weigh up whether you should be using gut strings or synthetic strings. However, Baroque bows aren't overly expensive, so if you're good this year you can always ask Santa for one and then have a go. And then if you're playing Bach or any early music, Vivaldi for example, then at least you would have the choice and you can, you know, really question, okay, for my performance today here, do I want to use a Baroque bow or a modern bow? And that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to get across in this video. It's not a case of every time you perform Bach and Vivaldi you must use a Baroque bow. If you've got a very, very big, if you're the concerto soloist in the Four Seasons and you've got a whole string orchestra behind you and they're all using normal bows, which would kind of be expected, you know, particularly of schools or younger ensembles, then that's going to be very loud. If you, as a young soloist, are performing, the Baroque bow is going to make you slightly quieter, slightly lighter, and this might not actually work in your favour if nobody can particularly hear you and you're not matching the sound of the ensemble. If you're playing a concerto, maybe use your modern bow. If you're playing solo or just with a piano or something, then maybe use your Baroque bow. It's nice to have the choice. So wind and brass were also very, very different. We don't really have any brass players in the class at the minute, so I won't go into too much detail. The valves that you have nowadays, they didn't exist. They were all natural horns and natural trumpets, so it was just one big tube and you would have to kind of change the note with your embouchure, so with the mouth, which you do with modern instruments, but then you can kind of change the length of the tubes with the valves. That's what the valves do, and then you get more harmonics. With the valves you only get the harmonics of the one tube length that you have in the natural horns. So that's a very big change. Flutes were not so much of a big change. They sound pretty similar, but modern flutes are made of metal, and back in the days of Bach they were still made of wood, so they sound slightly more like a recorder does than a modern flute, but it's still kind of got that breathy, light kind of fluty sound. And their clarinets didn't exist. Oboes and bassoons are relatively similar as well, they haven't changed an awful lot. But the one thing that has changed a lot is the keyboard. So let's take Bach again as an example. So Bach's works would have been played on either a harpsichord, which was the keyboard instrument he had at the time, or an organ, which has remained pretty much the same over the centuries. The modern piano did not exist in the time of Bach. Today's piano is a descendant of the harpsichord. It kind of came about because people were playing louder and louder and bigger, and the harpsichord couldn't really take that. If you kind of listen to the works of Liszt in particular, who was one of the main reasons why the piano is as big with like the massive steel frame that it has today, is because he's whacking it and there are more notes and there's a bigger sound, there's a more range of dynamics. There's now a sustain pedal, so it's not just kind of pluck and over, it's hit and ring. It's got a more broad soundscape. So this is obviously very different to the harpsichord, which is kind of little like pluck, 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 pluck. So let's listen to a piece. So we're going to listen to Bach's Fugue in C minor from the first book of the Well Tempo Clavier. We're going to listen to it first on the organ, then on the harpsichord, and then on the piano. So these are incredibly different timbres, complete worlds apart. So not everyone has a harpsichord just kind of willy-nilly lying around that they can always play their Bach on. That's normal. So when you're playing Bach on piano, think about the differences between the harpsichord and the piano. So we've mentioned some of these already, but other ones are the sustain pedal does nowhere near as much on a harpsichord as it does on today's pianos. These are completely different. So if you're playing Bach, maybe don't swamp it with pedal to kind of give it a great big resonance. That's not going to be how it was played, and it's going to make the notes very, very smushy. There's also nowhere near as much dynamic range on the harpsichord. It barely has any. So don't whack it like it's Beethoven in a bit of a I'm angry and no one's often quiet. That's not going to happen. So, resident concert pianist is back. Let's listen now to an informed performance of some Bach and an uninformed performance of some Bach. So notice how in the uninformed performance there was also a lot of use of rubato. Rubato literally means bending time. This is a very romantic way of playing things, which isn't necessarily appropriate to be used in Baroque music and classical music, so on and so forth.